Hi, I want to talk to you today about the problem of God's foreknowledge, and in particular about Anselm's approach to that problem. Anselm discusses this mostly in his work De Concordia. There he gives an account of God's foreknowledge and an answer to the problem posed by fatalism, the idea that all of our actions are determined, that we have no freedom of the will. Anselm is a voluntarist. He believes in freedom of the will, a radical freedom of the will, where everything we do is done willingly, and indeed that we will to will precisely what we will. We bear full responsibility for our actions. God's foreknowledge, however, has often been thought to be incompatible with human freedom. Anselm recognizes this and lays out the argument right at the beginning of De Concordia. He says, "For what God foreknows shall necessarily come to be in the future, while the things brought about by free choice don't issue from any kind of necessity." Christians, on the other hand, should be committed to both. They should be committed to God's foreknowledge. The reason is obvious. God is omniscient. God knows what's happened. God knows what's happening now in the present. God knows what will happen in the future. And so God, being omniscient, knows everything. God has foreknowledge of everything that will occur. But Anselm thinks Christians should be committed as well to the existence of freedom of the will. Why? Freedom of the will consists in the preservation of the rectitude of our own will for its own sake. That is to say, it's a power of keeping justice, a power of maintaining the rightness of our will for its own sake. God, of course, wants us to have the ability to have rectitude of the will, not only because God is good, because rectitude of the will consists in willing to will what God would will us to will. And so, of course, God wills that we will to do what God wants us to do, that we will as God would will us to will. Consequently, of course, God wills our own freedom, wills our rectitude, wills us the power of maintaining it. And so Christianity, he thinks, is committed both to God's foreknowledge and to the freedom of the will. So if they're incompatible, Christianity is in deep, deep trouble. Let's look at the traditional argument for incompatibility, the argument for determinism or fatalism that tries to rule out human freedom. How does it go? This is something that goes all the way back to ancient times. It's something that I think is a version, an elaborated version, of something that was known in ancient times as the master argument. But inserting God into this picture does complicate it in a variety of ways. So let's take a look at how the argument goes. Assume that P here is some true proposition about what you're going to do in the future. It may be that you are going to brush your teeth tonight, or that you are going to eat food tomorrow, or that you are going to go to sleep at some point within the next week. Something that is true about you. Okay, now we're going to take that, whatever it is, and try to argue that it's a necessary truth, that you couldn't possibly do otherwise, and so that you have no freedom with respect to that choice you're going to make in the future. Let's think about how this argument goes. The first premise is one of God's foreknowledge. Yesterday, God believed that P. In other words, P is this true proposition about what you're going to do, what you're going to choose to do is our idea. And so yesterday, God, having foreknowledge that you would choose to do that, believed that you would do that. So yesterday, God believed that P. The second premise is one of historical necessity. The past is now necessary. We can't change the past. Whatever happened yesterday, well, that's now necessary. That's a given. Can't be changed. And so it's not possible for us to change the past. We can't go back in time. Step 3, which we deduce from 1 and 2. It is now necessary that God believed yesterday that P. We said that God did believe that yesterday, since God is omniscient, but also that the past is necessary. So it's now necessary that God believed that P yesterday. Step 4, God is omniscient, and anything God believes must be true. So we can conclude that necessarily, if God believed that P yesterday, then P. Now we introduce a somewhat complex modal proposition as step 5. If A, whatever it is now necessary, and necessarily, if A then B, then it's now necessary that B. The idea here is that if a conditional if-then statement and its antecedent, the if part, are both necessarily true, then so is the consequent. In an untense version, this is a principle of any normal modal logic. The idea here is simply that if you've got a necessary truth And then it implies some other truth. That truth must be necessary. In other words, necessary truths imply other necessary truths. Step 6, it's now necessary that P. This comes from steps 3, 4, and 5. We said that it's now necessary that yesterday God believed that P, and necessarily if God believes something, it's true, so it's now necessarily true that P. But now by the definition of necessity, it's then impossible for me to do anything else. P is now true of necessity. In other words, it's necessarily true now that I'm going to do something tomorrow, that I'm going to do something in the future, and so that means I can't do otherwise. But if I can't do otherwise, I have no freedom. That, step 8, is called the principle of alternative possibilities. So conclusion, step 9, I have no freedom. Let's take a particular case. Tomorrow is Monday. I'll be on chat rooms with my students. I will freely choose to do that. I could abscond. I could head for the border in Mexico or something like that. But no, I'm going to choose to do it. Let's assume that's true. But now we can say, God being omniscient believed yesterday that I would be on a chat room tomorrow. But whatever God believes must be true since God is omniscient. So it's got to be true that I'm going to be in a chat room tomorrow. Moreover, the past is necessary, so it's a necessary truth that God believed that yesterday. But necessary truths imply other necessary truths. So it's a necessary truth that I will be in that chat room tomorrow. But if it's a necessary truth, then I can't possibly do otherwise. I have no option of not being in that chat room. And so I have no freedom, since freedom is a matter of having the ability to do that or not to do it, having alternative possibilities. For me to choose to be in that chat room freely, it must be possible for me to do otherwise. But we've just argued it's not possible for me to do otherwise because it's a necessary truth that I will do it. Well, now it feels intuitively as if something's gone wrong in this argument. And there have been a variety of ways of trying to get out of it. Here's option A, Aristotle's option. To say, well, there's something wrong with this whole idea of future propositions having a truth value, and so being the kind of thing that God could truly or not believe. There simply is no truth value established for something that's in the future. And so God isn't going to have a belief about that. All God's beliefs are true, let's agree about that. But on the other hand, God then won't believe things about the future because none of those things are yet true or false. His example is about a sea battle, and he considers the proposition, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Is that true or false? We don't know, but Aristotle says it's not just that it is true or is false and we don't know it, it's that it's right now neither true nor false. It could go either way. And so it is not true now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. It's not false now that there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Have to wait and see. And that's not just an epistemic matter, a matter of knowledge. It will not be determined whether that's true or false until the sea battle happens or fails to happen. Well, that's one way out. We could deny that future propositions have any truth values at all. And if they're neither true nor false, they're not true. So God, being omniscient, won't believe them. So the argument really can't get off the ground. We reject this at the very first premise. We say, no, God didn't believe it yesterday because it wasn't even true yesterday. The second option, B, is one chosen by Boethius. God doesn't exist in time. God has an existence outside time. In fact, God creates time in creating the universe. That doesn't trap God inside time. God is in a position outside of time, in something like an eternal present that is not in any given position. And that means God's knowledge, like God's causal activity, God's willing, and so on, all take place outside of time. So this gives us a different reason for rejecting that first premise, that God believed that P yesterday. It's not so much that we have to say with Aristotle that P wasn't even true yesterday. Maybe it was true yesterday. The point is that God's beliefs are outside of space and time. To say God believed it yesterday is already to commit some kind of mistake. God believes it from outside of space and time. And so it isn't a question of the passage of time affecting any of this for God. God is not in time. And so we get off the boat right at the first premise, saying, sorry, God is outside of time, God's beliefs are outside of time. To talk about God believing something yesterday is already a fundamental mistake. The third possible position, C, is compatibilism. We might say, well, look, the problem is really with premise 8. that principle of alternative possibilities. And the difficulty here isn't so much something about the nature of freedom itself, it's that freedom, well, that's just what we call being necessitated and not knowing about it. So the will is completely determined. Yeah, I'm acting in the way I'm acting, and I will do tomorrow what I will do tomorrow out of necessity. It's all been predetermined. But, I don't know that. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow, and we call that decision-making, even though it's determined, when I don't know what I have to do, and it feels to me like I'm making a choice, we call that freedom. But it's a seeming freedom. It's not, in a sense, the freedom that Anselm wants to defend, that the real defender, the libertarian or voluntarist conception of freedom of the will goes along with. But it says, look, we talk about freedom of the will, and that's really compatible with determinism. Yes, my actions are determined, but there's a kind of determination of which we're ignorant that we call freedom. D, another option, is to simply embrace determinism. To say, yeah, goodbye freedom. We don't have freedom of the will, and we might do that. We might just say, yes, God predestines everything, God predetermines everything, there is no such thing as freedom of the will. At least at certain stages of their thought, it seems that Martin Luther and John Calvin both held that position. They just accepted there is no freedom. Everything is the work of God in predestining things, and then in giving grace to some and not others, there is no freedom. There are other options. William of Ockham, for example, rejects the second premise. He ends up saying this whole idea of the past being necessary is fishy. Yes, there's a kind of sense in which the past is necessary. I can't change the past. What's done is done. But look, that isn't the kind of necessity we're interested in when we get to the end of the argument. That's a funny, bogus kind of necessity. He distinguishes hard facts from soft facts. And the general idea, which is somewhat hard to make precise, but I think the general idea is this. The kind of necessity the past has is a kind of necessity that is, notice, time indexed. I can say now that yes, what happened yesterday is necessary, but it wasn't necessary yesterday, and it wasn't necessary the day before that. This is a kind of necessity that we attribute after the fact. It's a funny, soft kind of necessity, if you want to think of it that way. And so when we say that the past is necessary, well, it's true in one sense, it's not true in another. Yes, it's necessary from our point of view now, but it's not necessary in a broader metaphysical sense. It has a kind of cheap, after-the-fact necessity. It doesn't have real necessity. And so in the end, what I really end up showing is that, what I do tomorrow, that's going to look necessary after the fact. In other words, day after tomorrow, you'll be able to say, yeah, it was necessary because now we can't change what happened yesterday. But that's a cheap kind of necessity. Yeah, there's that kind of necessity, and it will have that kind of necessity, but that doesn't make it necessary now, and it doesn't make it necessary in some global deterministic sense. It's necessary only in this funny, sort of Pickwickian, after-the-fact sense. So 2 is false, in the sense in which it's really intended to establish some kind of metaphysical necessity. Now, part of the point here is that there's a funny kind of backward causal dependence going on. That's part of what's strange about this after-the-fact kind of necessity. You might say, God believes, yes, and maybe even God believed yesterday that I would do this sort of thing tomorrow. But on the other hand, God's belief was because I will do it tomorrow. And so it's not that God believes it, and that determines this future. It's rather that what's going to happen in the future determines God's belief in the past. It's an odd kind of backward causation, or backward causal or counterfactual dependence. If I were to choose to do something else tomorrow, then God would have believed that other thing yesterday. And that's different from the usual kind of counterfactual dependence and the usual kind of causal relationship. So in short, Ockham is saying there's something very odd about this. It is not something that gives the right kind of necessity. Another option, also developed later, in fact several hundred years after Ockham, was developed by Luis de Molina. It's known as the Molinist solution. The Molinist talks about something known as middle knowledge. God has knowledge of what we will do, moreover of what we would do in all sorts of possible counterfactual circumstances, and has that knowledge even before the creation of the world. In fact, God uses it to decide how to create the world, to help shape that future that is going to result from our free choices. So, de Molina says, it is possible for God to will something and create a world that he foreknows at the very beginning of time will go a certain way. And in that sense, God does have complete foreknowledge of what's going to happen, including what's going to happen tomorrow. But God foreknows that because God has all that middle knowledge of what I will do under these various circumstances. And so God is able to deduce that, yes, tomorrow you're going to do that, but that doesn't mean I don't choose it freely. God knows in advance that I will make a free choice to do that. Well, finally, you could attack premise 8. You could say that principle of alternative possibilities is false. And that's something that, in a certain sense, the compatibilist does, but also a variety of contemporary philosophers have done. Harry Frankfurt has a famous argument like this, saying, look, you might choose something freely even though you couldn't do otherwise. Imagine that a neurosurgeon has planted a switch in your brain that is such that if you don't choose to do this thing, it will trigger and force you to do that thing. But then you do actually make the choice to do it, and so the neurosurgeon never has to trigger the switch. You can be said to have acted freely. The switch was never triggered, you weren't forced, but nevertheless, you couldn't have done otherwise. If you hadn't made that choice, the neurosurgeon would have flipped the switch and forced you into making that choice. So we have freedom even though we have no possibility of doing otherwise.